Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And we've got another bonus episode for you.
Yes, we're very happy to have Emily Wilson as our guest today for this bonus episode. Emily is a professor of classical studies, and she's the graduate chair of the program in comparative literature and literary theory at the University of Pennsylvania. And she's done a number of translations of ancient Greek and Latin literature, especially a very well-received translation of the Odyssey. Thank you for joining us, Emily.
It's great to be here.
So we wanted to talk with you very specifically about the translation you've done of the Odyssey, which is fantastic. We really enjoyed engaging with it over our last episode where we were talking about Homer's poem, but also talking a little bit more widely about translation practice and your sense of the poem and your sense of what it is to work in ancient literature. The Odyssey translation is not the first major translation you've undertaken. Has the ways in which you approach translation changed over time? Like, how do you come into it?
So the first published translation that I did was of Seneca's tragedies. I just did 6 of them. I kind of wish I'd done all of them, but they said that was not an economic. There were too many. People weren't going to buy all of them. Anyway, so I was first asked to do that because I'd written about Seneca, and I realized in doing that project just how interesting it was, just the process of trying to figure out how do I convey something of the specific style, the specific feel of this text in a completely different literary context, a completely different language. I mean, I do think that both every new text as well as every new author is a totally different new challenge. I mean, whatever I've learned about translation from Seneca didn't transfer into, then I'm going to do the same thing with Euripides. No, I can't do the same thing because, in fact, Euripides, the whole feel of the dramatic voice is totally different. The way people speak is totally different in Euripides versus Seneca, even though, of course, they're both verse drama. There were some questions that are the same about how do you convey the metricality, the rhythm, the formal qualities of the original text in a context where we're not necessarily used to plays being in verse. So thinking about verse form has been important to me in all my projects.
That's so interesting. I was very curious. Do you find the experience different? How can I put it? Translating from Latin, translating from Greek? Like, is the language, the language that you're coming from in a translation process, does that affect your thinking? Or is that kind of transparent, that part of it kind of transparent?
I don't see the language itself as being particularly the main thing. I mean, I think I see the particulars of the original text as being the main thing. I mean, the leap from Euripides to Sophocles was huge. I just did a translation of Oedipus Tyrannos. On some level, they were contemporaries. On some level, they're writing in the same genre as well as in the same language, and it wasn't at all the same process. I mean, the question of how do I convey the dense metaphors in Sophocles versus how do I convey the conversationality of Euripides, that challenge, I mean, it didn't feel to me that this is just the same because they're both ancient Greek. No, I didn't think that at all.
I guess I wondered about it with regard to Latin in particular, because I don't have your translation experience, but I'll translate things from medieval vernaculars and Latin now and then in the course of doing work. And when it's either Latin or a Latinate vernacular, so a Romance vernacular, I find that the temptation to, there's always an easy out. You can choose a word that is in some ways etymologically descended or resembles in some way, or as opposed to if you're doing something from a more remote language where there's not that kind of close affiliation. That's why I wondered about that, but perhaps when we're dealing with ancient texts, it's a very different kind of environment and the stakes are totally different. Or maybe it comes from long translation practice and being deep into it in the way that you've come to be over these years.
I think the question of, am I going to use a cognate word that's cognate with something in the original? Of course, that comes up more often with a Latin text than a Greek text if you're writing in English, because there are more Latinisms than there are Gricisms in the English language. So that's certainly a question. And then the question of what does a Latinism do for your text? And is it doing the same thing that the actually being in Latin is doing for the original? Yes, I mean, I think that does come up, but then my instinct is usually to think, no, whatever the word that descends from this word it means something different, so I'm probably not going to use it.
This is a text that you would have studied as you were learning ancient Greek, as when you were young and taking your first classes in it. You would have been studying it. You would have been translating it as exercises. You would have had a long history of translating the text in that sense, I imagine, and yet it's a very different thing when you're going to decide to translate the entirety of the text and to try to find a coherent voice for the whole thing. Did you ever think about that voice, what that voice of the Odyssey could be like in English before you'd been commissioned to write the translation?
I really didn't. I mean, I'd never expected to be commissioned to translate the Odyssey. I mean, I started learning Greek in high school, and I can't remember if we read Homer in high school. I remember that the first time I read Homer was my first semester at Oxford. We read the whole of the Iliad and the Odyssey in Greek, and I wasn't translating. I mean, I was reading the Greek, and of course I was looking things up in dictionaries, but I was reading it. And so it didn't seem to me that this is translation. It seemed to me that was reading. And of course it's a very difficult and in the early stages very slow kind of reading, but it's reading as opposed to translation. I didn't think of myself as doing something that's at all like, what Lydia Davis does with Flaubert. It just felt like I'm reading this text and getting to know it. I mean, it's really only when I started doing the Seneca translations that I was thinking it might actually be interesting to think about translating more professionally.
That's also sort of pedagogically interesting because I did a year of Greek, but having, done Latin into the PhD level, in classes, we were always translating it as a way of showing knowledge. Sometimes it was just translating it in class, sort of somewhat, prepared extemporaneously. But that issue of turning to translation was always there, much more so than interpretation or writing essays about it, at least in terms of the language classes.
I know. I mean, I think in a way that's a problem that's endemic in the pedagogy of ancient languages, right? That the whole question of how do we both achieve fluency and how do we demonstrate fluency? How do we know that everybody actually understands how the syntax works in this sentence? The quickest way to do that is to go around the table and have everybody come up with their terrible translation, which if it's the early stages and you've only done a year of the language, then there are probably going to be some students who they've learned the translation by heart from the internet in some cases, in which case it's sort of substituting for reading the original. And I think it would be great if there were more focus in the ancient Greek and Latin classroom on trying to think of exercises that aren't that, because it's not necessarily the best way to achieve fluency, I think.
That's such an interesting distinction between these different, in other words, we use the same word translation to talk about that reading aloud in class. That's about demonstrating fluency and mastery, in dealing with a text. And then the production of a full translation, we use the same word, but they're very different acts, aren't they?
They're totally different things. I mean, I think on some level, if you're sort of using quote unquote translation to get to fluency, it can block you from the kind of fluency that you might need at a later stage if you wanted to produce a translation. Because, of course, to produce a translation, you have to be immersed in the original rather than be constantly substituting your own trot for whatever you're reading.
So when you finally were starting to work on a translation of something like the Odyssey, when you're finally tackling that big project, where did you begin? Like, do you pick a passage and then try to figure out the right voice for a smaller subsection of it? Do you think about key terms? Do you pick a favorite passage, or do you pick a sort of boring passage? How does that start?
A boring passage would have been a good idea, actually. I didn't. Yes, I mean it's hard to think which passage in the Odyssey is boring. There aren't any boring bits. I was surprised to realize once I got to book 3 how Nestor's boring speeches are actually not even that boring. They're really quite interesting. So the passage that I chose as a proposal, because of course I signed up, the lovely editor at Norton that Suzanne and I both know, Pete Simon, was the one who asked me to consider doing it. And of course, to convince his colleagues that Norton should sign me up, I needed to both do a proposal explaining why the world might need another English translation, even though there were already 60-something English translations out there. Why would anyone buy a new one? I think that was a reasonable question to ask. And then also do a sample proving that there would be something distinctive about my version. And the passage that I chose for that was most of Book 9. And I chose that section because I wanted to try and use a section that had both some wonderful similes, some wonderful description, and also an encounter between two characters from completely different perspectives. And it seemed to me that that's actually a section that I've taught more often than I've taught the whole thing. And it seemed to me in going through Book 9 with students that quite often they had preconceptions about the Cyclops is a bad guy, and this is about a hero encountering a bad guy. And it was quite difficult in the classroom with several different translations to get across that the text might be doing something a bit more complicated than that. So I wanted to choose that section because I knew already that there might be things that a new translation could enable pedagogically that would be different from just here's the heroic Western person and the evil savage. And then, as I say, I wanted to, play around with the wonderful alliteration of the sizzling eyeball and the way that there's both so much emotion and in the terror of the men waiting in the cave and the violence, and then also the beauty of here's this wonderful new dawn and it's going to be a different kind of dawn. So it seemed to me that it was a section where I could, within maybe 300 lines, convey a lot of the different things that the Odyssey can do.
Absolutely. So did you make decisions in your first translation, in your test translation of that passage, that you later revised as you went on to translate the whole thing?
Well, I was constantly revising and revising, so it's hard. In fact, I should have, before talking to you, gone back and reread my proposal, because I do have the document of that somewhere or other. I knew from the start that two of the big formal things that I definitely wanted to do, one was just to make sure that it's in a very regular iambic pentameter meter all the way through, because, of course, one of the big things that I felt about the existing translations that people usually used was that there's something, I think, problematic about translating a regular metrical text into free verse in the way that most of the translations that people are usually assigned in class do.
And the pentameter here flows so nicely. It feels so natural. You have the form of the verse, but it just flows beautifully. It gave me so much pleasure in reading this. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you. Yes. So I knew from the start that I wanted to do regular iambic pentameter, not rhyming, but very regular metrically. And I also knew from the start that I had a sense with other translations that they tended to be quite a lot longer than the original and feel a bit too slow. So I wanted to experiment with whether I could make it line for line. And I realized in just doing the sample that it seemed like I actually could do that without sort of skipping huge chunks. And now that I'm working on the Iliad, I think I'm not going to be able to do that. So it's going to be in a way similar formally, but it's going to still be iambic pentameter. But I don't think I can do the line for line.
That's interesting. Do you have a sense of why that is already? Is it because you can't compress some of the added detail that's in the Iliad, like some of those lists and things like that?
The lists are the problem, and the names are the problem. There are too many patronymics. I managed to do book 1 line for line, and then book 2 kind of killed me. This last 6 months, I've been working on the catalogue of ships.
Yeah. Oh man, no.
You can't. Whatever the name of the person is, there is almost all of its names. They're very long names. You can't just make up nicknames to try and shorten it. It's going to take as long as the names really matter.
Because that's super important, right? In terms of who these people are and what they represent, and the whole culture that they're standing for, right?
The whole question of how do homosocial male bonds get created and represented in the poem, it's all about lists of male names. This person has to be descended from this other man, and you can't just constantly skip the patronymic, because that somehow detracts from the way that relationships are formed and the way that honor is figured through naming and through male relationships.
Absolutely.
So it's going to have to be a little bit longer, because I need all the names.
I'm very curious about that in particular, because you've talked a lot about how some of your goals in translating the Odyssey were to make it very accessible, not in a dumbing down kind of way, but just in a sense that this is a very relevant text. It echoes a lot of the concerns of a contemporary to us reader about how we treat strangers, and well, the list is endless. But I'm curious about some of the details in the Iliad, especially in Book 2, the list of ships and the list of the people who brought them. That just seems like it's such an alien passage. We don't have as much of a relationship to these Greek people as I always imagine it being recited at some sort of gathering of people from different nations, sort of rooting for when their person comes up in the list. Mm-hmm. Like, how do you make any of that meaningful for a contemporary reader?
Some people are going to get lost with the names, no matter how hard I try. But I also think, I think actually the catalogue of ships, in a way, is the gesture of globalization. It's a way of saying this conflict may seem as if it's located in a particular place in Asia Minor at a particular time. This is just taking place over less than 2 months. This poem is very, very concentrated in terms of being in a tiny place and a tiny space of time. But it belongs to the whole world. Look, let me list all these different people coming from all these different places. All these places are different. All these leaders are different. And there may be formulae to a certain number of them come. They all seem to have male leaders, and it's guys who are coming. I mean, also it's saying things about what is masculinity that I think are absolutely relevant, still to us today, or even more to us today, about what is aggression, how do wars start, but also just about how do we figure the whole world, and how can the whole world happen? How can a global conflict be played out in a tiny place?
Mm-hmm. And a tiny place, and within very tightly defined family structures on both sides. And as you say, in that very small scope of time.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it has a global reach. That's a really neat way of approaching it.
Mm-hmm. I'm very much looking forward to that, to how you handle that. I am very fond of lists in general, and therefore Book 2 has a special appeal to me.
Lists are fun too, yes. Yes. But I also think that, especially if as I say, I was in agony about it for the last 6 months, but I think insofar as I ever succeed in making the names sound good in the meter, it's an invitation to read out loud and just think about the sounds. And it doesn't have to be that everything is something you can sort of write an essay about every single name. It can partly just be about the pleasure of I'm hearing these sounds. These sounds in English are almost the same as the sounds in Greek.
Yeah.
And then that's the closest to the original that you're going to get in the translation, is the list of the names.
One of the things that I always loved in the medieval texts that I was looking at were these poetic lists of names, especially when they would get to use Greek or especially Hebrew names. And they just get so excited about the sound of them and the trickiness of putting it into the meter. And it was a sort of pure poetry at that point.
Exactly.
Well, speaking of Greek, I was wondering if you'd be willing to read us a section of the text in the original, since my Greek is very poor, and I don't think Suzanne has ever studied it.
No. And also, picking up on some of the things you were saying earlier, Emily, about rhythm. When you were talking about translation of Greek drama, you were talking about finding the rhythm and the orality, the sound, and the effect on the hearer. Was that something that you felt like you were able to bring out in your translation of the Odyssey, or in the work you're doing on the Iliad now? Like, I don't know if there's maybe, when you read a passage for us, if there's one that might illustrate that really well.
The thing is that the sounds that I'm creating in my translation are different from the sounds of the original necessarily, because both I use a different meter from the original. The original has a very clear meter, but it's a meter that's specific to the literary culture of archaic Greece, as opposed to the tradition of Anglophone poetry. It's specific to this language, not the language I'm speaking now. The sounds are different. Where possible, I try to think about, when there's alliteration in the original, as there very often is, I try to alliterate, if not in that exact word, then nearabouts, that kind of thing. This is Book 5, the journey of Hermes to the island of Calypso. Autica pe superposine desotocala pedila, ambrosia crucea, tarmin feron emenef hugren, ede peironad gaian hamapnoia sanem moia. Hele to debrabdown, te dandron omata thelge, hone thele tu stauta kai hupno ontasegere. Ten metakersine con petetocratus arge fontes, piariene pibas dexaithros empeseponto, suete pete picuma la ro ornithi eoikos, hoste catadelus colpus halos atrugatoio. Ictus agros son pucinab terra duetai halna, to hecalos pola essin orchestrato cumasin Hermes. Al hote de tenes on afficato telotheusan, enthec pontubas io eideos peronda, eien offra megoapseos hicato, to ani numfanaen eu plocamos, tendendothi tetnen eusan, purmen escarofin megacaiator, telothi dodme kedru du ekel toio thou ananeson dode diomenon, he dendon iodai deusa opicala, histone poicomene crose ker kid huvainen. Hula despeos amphi perfuke telethosa, Claire daige ros tecai uo des parissos, entha de ornithes tanus sipteroi unas donta, Scupes, direces, tenu, glossoi te coronae, ein aliae te sinte thalassia ergamamelen. Maybe I should stop that. It seems like it's long, right? No, it's very beautiful, though. Yes.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
You will be perhaps happy to hear that included in that passage is one of the sections of your translation that I had singled out for being quite lovely.
Yes. I love the original of that passage. It's great.
Chris, read the translation of the part that you'd singled out.
It was a bit where you used some very nice alliteration.
Yes. Well, the original does too. Maybe my reading didn't emphasize that enough. But yeah.
He plunged into the sea and swooped between the waves, just like a seagull catching fish, wetting its whirring wings in tireless brine. So Hermes scudded through the surging swell, etc. Just really nice, bright, appropriate use of alliteration there.
Yeah, it's such an interesting translation in so many ways. The bringing across of the alliteration that we've been talking about, the way that there'll be repetitive formulaic phrases in the Greek, and then you'll render them in different ways. So the rosy-fingered dawn, for example, shows up in so many different forms. And it's neat because you can always recognize it. Like you always go, rosy-fingered dawn.
Yes.
You know it's the repeated phrase, but it doesn't feel awkward the way it would be if you did that literally, word in a word-for-word kind of way. So that's a really neat feature to it, I felt.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I obviously this is something which, if you're asking about what did I either change my mind about or just go back and forth about, just the degree to which I felt the reader could stand word for word repetition, I spent a huge amount of time just trying to figure that out and then changing my mind about where exactly should I have exact repetition, where should I have variatio. I mean, I thought I wanted some element of exact repetition. I mean, I sort of put in wine dark C, because I wanted the reader to get the flavour of this is a repetitive text. But it seemed as if, I did sort of experiments with, can I actually do the same thing with Rosy Fingered Dawn every single time? How lame is that going to feel? And I felt it was actually going to feel pretty lame. Because, our expectations are so different, our experiences of reading are so different, our experiences with repetition are so different. So I wanted the reader to have a sense of, yes, we're aware that there are a lot of dawns, and these always seem to have the same components, but not necessarily always the same words.
Well, we get a feeling of familiarity, but not repetitiveness, I think, is the effect, which works really, really well. One of the aspects of this translation that seems to be very much in keeping with what we've just been talking about is the way in which anachronism appears and disappears. There are moments where there's, how can I put it? We're very aware this is an ancient world. The language is telling us this is an ancient world, a very distant world. And at other moments where it feels proximate, and that rhythm, that equilibrium is something that, is fundamental to a successful translation. And I wondered if that's something we could talk about a little bit more, like how does that balance get achieved? It's a choice, right? Whether to choose a slightly archaizing language, whether to choose a very contemporary feeling language. And when there's a balance, as there is in this one, how do you find that balance? And what are the moments where you want to feel a temporal distance, and what are the moments where you don't necessarily want to feel that so much?
I don't know. I didn't have a formula. I didn't have a sort of a decision ahead of time. This is the exact percentage by which I'm going to make the reader feel alienated versus connected. I've read quite a lot of translation theory, and I'm conscious of the whole question of the degree to which a translator chooses to be visible or invisible, chooses to make the reader aware of I'm reading a translation versus I'm not reading a translation. I think the degree to which, the strategies that you use to make the reader at some points wake up to this is a translation, this is not the same as the original. Those are somewhat different if it's an ancient text, because our expectations are different about what is an ancient text going to sound like. I think the questions then of to what degree do you foreignize, to what degree do you archaize? I think those are actually somewhat different things of, is it going to be archaic? Is it going to be foreignized? And also in the case of epic, is it going to be show-off, bombastic kind of epic language, or is it going to be some other kind of epic language? I wanted to have all of those elements to be somewhat unpredictable. That I didn't want the reader to feel that she's going to absolutely know ahead of time, Homer, that's from back in the day, so it's going to be, oldie-worldy, or else it's going to be foreignized, written in a language that's supposedly English but isn't actually English. But then I also wanted to have a sense that it feels transparent, it feels like these people are real people, but then it also feels every so often, I felt it wasn't necessarily that every simile is going to be that moment, or every encounter between people is going to be that moment. But maybe every couple of pages or every few scenes, there's going to be some moment when there's a surprising word choice, or it's somehow a little bit closer to our world than you thought, or else it's a little bit further from our world than you thought.
Yeah, that sense of it being a kind of a distance, not necessarily a temporal distance, but like a different world from our own. That feeling comes out really acutely at certain moments. One of the moments I remember feeling that very strongly is a moment that we, I think, inevitably talked about a little bit in the episode we did, the scene where the slave women are killed after Odysseus' return, and how that's a scene of extraordinary violence. And then there's this metaphor about doves, which has this. On the one hand, we're accustomed to scenes of violence. We have cinematic violence all the time, right? And then our world is a world with violence in it, and we see it through different forms of media. But when there's the metaphor doing that strange kind of work there, it kind of puts us off balance in a certain kind of way. And so it's something that is intelligible to us immediately and familiar, and also we're off balance.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it seems to me that that particular simile, I think the similes in Homer often do some version of this, of just giving you a completely different perspective, or maybe several different perspectives on the scene. On one level, we see what Telemachus thinks as he's about to murder these 12 people, and we see exactly how he goes about this murder. We know where he's coming from. And then we know the mechanics of how is he going to go about doing this? Where will he fasten the rope to? I mean, the Homeric poems are so good on just the details of the material world. And if you want to build a ship, or if you want to hang 12 women, this is how you would tie the rope, where you would do it. Which in fact is what most the commentators on that scene, was a whole lot of getting hung up on. But wouldn't the rope have to be very, very thick?
Really? Oh, wow.
Yes. And then you get this extraordinarily different perspective on the scene, which is given by the simile, of the narrator and the voice of the simile, where you get to see, both on some level, there's something beautiful, there's something purposive about this, but it's a totally different kind of purposiveness from Telemachus's purposes. And the purpose of the birds is they want to go back to their nests.
Yes.
Right? That it gets us to, and how did it feel for those women? I felt like they wanted to go somewhere completely different. And then there was this horror implemented by a different species on them, such that their desire to go home, their nostos, was cut short, and instead they're dead.
Yeah, there's so much packed into that passage. That's extraordinary.
It is, yes. Yeah, I mean, I think it's both gives us the sense of, how do, young people who've been lonely and bullied all their lives, how do they act out by picking on other people? The whole question of how do massacres happen? Why do young men choose to kill vast numbers of people and feel that they're being invaded by them?
Yeah, and thinking about the extent to which that's part of a coming of age process, part of a dynamic of fathers and sons, and so on. Like what are the social ends of that scene, right? It invites us to think about that.
It does, but I think you're absolutely right to pick up on the simile, because that takes us to such a different direction, where we're not thinking about those things. We're thinking about the birds and about the women.
Yeah. And following up more on the question of how the simile is working there, there's many ways in which your work in this translation is intersecting with translation studies broadly, the study of ancient Greek literature broadly, Homeric translation in particular. But were you also, either consciously or looking back, perhaps unconsciously, engaging with contemporary poetic moves? Like, in other words, to some extent, it's a scholarly historicist act to carry out translation, but it's also an intensely creative act, and you're engaging in poetics in a really profound kind of way. Do you have a sense of being in conversation when you're doing your translation with either currently publishing poets or poets of another period? Like, is there more than one time in the poetics of your translation work?
I think there's certainly more than one time. I mean, I felt that, when I was doing those translations of Seneca, I thought a lot about how, should there be any element of, it's visible in my translation that even though it's trying to be 21st century English, I've also spent quite a lot of time reading the 10 Tragedies of Seneca, the early modern translations of the same text, as well as I've spent huge amounts of time rereading Shakespeare. Should that be visible? I thought, in fact, it should be visible, because Seneca is such an elusive writer, and there's so much of quotation or half quotation of Ovid and Virgil in Seneca. Whereas in the case of Homer, just the whole, can you talk about allusion in a text that emerges from an oral tradition? I don't think you can exactly. So I didn't want it to feel sort of full of quotes. I didn't want it to feel like, here's Wilson quoting Byron kind of thing. Even though I also felt that I think even if I hadn't wanted this, it would be the case that it must be visible that I've read a lot of poetry. And then maybe on just a more specific level, I felt that when I thought about how the choice to make it very regular metrically, I thought about that as an attempt to intervene in a way, and just to say, poets writing right now, or the poets who are going to have read this translation in 9th grade and then they'll be publishing poetry, maybe it will feel less alien to them that they could actually write in meter. It would be a possible choice. And I want that to be a possible choice for the poets of 10 years from now, in a way that I think it doesn't necessarily feel possible for a lot of contemporary poets. I think it's sort of weird how formal poetry is so much of a niche thing right now, in a way that it wasn't, even 50 years ago, it wasn't a niche thing. So maybe there's some kind of intervention in that way.
I suppose poetry in general is a bit of a niche thing these days as well. But
oh, no, don't say that. No.
I say this coming from a poetry background, of course. But
yes.
I was also curious about when you've talked about translating it into iambic pentameter and into that formalism. Of course, one of the questions, if you want to geek out on this, is like, which iambic pentameter, whose iambic pentameter, what that means to write an iambic pentameter, and what the specific rhythms and what's possible and allowed in terms of the subtle alterations, or how you think of what the shape of that line looks like, has changed dramatically over centuries.
Yes.
So were there particular iambic pentameter formal poets, contemporary or older, that you were thinking about as you were trying to figure out what your line sounded like?
As I was I was trying to say that I wanted it not to be, not to have a sense of I'm going to take a particular author and have it be modeled on X. I mean, even if it's Shakespeare, who is so voluminous and contains so many worlds, because I wanted it to feel old and new, rather than somewhere in the middle. I mean, I wanted to have a sense of I'm drawing on multiple rather than that I'm just drawing on one. My dissertation is partly, which was my first book, is partly about Milton. And so in the process of doing a translation that's a translation of an epic, and I'm writing an English epic, I kept thinking about, how much am I going to both be learning from the way Milton does enjambment, and I want to have a sense of verse paragraphs, not just of end-stop lines. But then I also want it to feel very, very un-Miltonic in the word choices, in the lack of Latinisms. In the processes of revision, part of what I worked on was just the degree to which I want it to feel sort of blocky, and there are little pieces in each line versus other sentences going to go on across one line into multiple lines. And that I kept sort of changing different passages to try and just change the timing of where the line breaks go, which felt to me partly a question of the degree to which it's Miltonic or not Miltonic. But I guess also, just more recent poets, I felt with particular passages, I would sort of either be looking back or not necessarily looking to contemporary poets, but just looking to, like when I was doing the Odysseus and Laertes encounter in book 24, I remember going back and rereading The Leech Gatherer by Wordsworth and thinking about how the weird perspectives of here's the privileged younger man encountering and the ways that passage in Homer might resonate with that poem. And then I ended up not actually quoting because I didn't want to quote, but just I think the fact that I'd reread it maybe did have an effect, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you'd filtered it through that in some way.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I wonder if there's a sense in which, how can I put it? There's a temporality of translation where, on the one hand, it's the ancient world that's the, if you're translating Homer, it's the ancient world you're engaging with. There's our own contemporary 21st century moment. But there are also other times that are kind of imminent in the translator's experience and in what the reader's going to bring to bear, the reader who's, read some of these other works.
I certainly see the task of translating these texts which have been known and reread so often throughout, not just the history of English, but also the history of earlier vernacular languages, that there's a sort of responsibility, or just a question about the degree to which a translator should come at the task with an awareness of that reception history as well as that translation history. I mean, didn't feel my job is going to involve reading every single other translation that's ever been written. But I did feel that if I'm going to be writing in English, this text which has this whole mythic history to it, and this whole oral tradition behind it, and then also this long history both of its own formation and composition, and then also this long history of being recited, being heard, being read, that I wanted to think about the long history of the English language, of English poetics and of English epic in particular, and just the degree to which my text should be thinking about that history as well as the ancient Greek history, and that it should be engaging between them. Because it seemed to me that there can be a sort of falsehood about sort of a translation that presents itself as this is a time machine, this is taking you back to ancient Greece, and yet it's in a language which is 2,000 years later than that. I mean, I'm conscious of, in a way, a sort of jealousy of people who translate modern languages, because if you translate a 19th century German text, then you can think about, so what is 19th century English like, and how can I give a sense of that, of however the original text sounds to a contemporary German reader if it's the German of 100 or 200 years ago, whereas you can't do that if it's an ancient text. So I think one has to think as a translator of very, very old texts which come from a period when English didn't exist. How can you convey both the sense of this is a text which was composed by people who were alive, for other people who were alive, which was alive in the mouths of those who were singing and performing it. And so it needs to feel alive again now for the new performances, the new experiences of it. And then also it has to have a sense of a long history, which is going to be enacted through the tools I have, which is the English language.
I think that's so interesting. It's what you feel that really acutely through some of the moments in your translation. One of the moments we talked about, again, predictably, was complicated. The term that you choose, which is very different from the choice that other translators have made to talk about Odysseus. And one of the things we commented on is that there are many things going on with that choice of term. This sort of physical sense of complicated and literal sense, folded over many times. Chris talked about that a bit. And also the sense that it's a very contemporary sense. If you ask me a question and I say, oh, it's complicated, that's almost a way for me not quite to answer the question. So it's a kind of a deferral, a kind of a pushing away. And we talked about the many different kinds of work that term is doing, which in some ways is a very different kind of choice, right? But it is true to the text in other kinds of ways and unexpected kinds of ways.
Yeah, I mean, I second guessed that choice many, 10th guessed it, 20th guessed it many, many times. But I said I wanted some sense of, I think, in a way, the choice of polytropon as the epithet that's used of Odysseus in that first line. It feels both, it's saying something about the protagonist, it's saying something about his journey, it's saying something about the poem that you're about to hear as well. It's referring to the mode of storytelling, the layeredness, the twistiness of this poem. And it's also, I think it's a kind of teaser. It's, as you say, it's suggesting there is a story here, and I'm not actually going to reveal it right now. You're not actually going to get the whole story in the first 10 lines. You're going to get a glimpse of something and an awareness that you're not getting it all.
And nothing could be more tantalizing.
And that's part of what that word does, and also part of what their poem does in general, is that it gives you a partial glimpse of what the poem is about.
We had a question sent in by a listener, which I think might be interesting to ask here, which is from Sophie, a high school student out in Portland who really has been enjoying your translation. And she wanted to know, how does a translator balance their own voice with that of the author? And she brings up your choice not to use nymph to describe Calypso when previous translators used that term, instead of using the, as she describes it, mythologically accurate goddess. And I'm also curious to add on to that, how much of this do you feel like is your voice? How much of this book feels like it's something that is yours in addition to, or rather than, and rather than is not the right word, but in addition to Homer's?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the question about nymph in a way takes us back to Suzanne's earlier questions about Latinisms if you're translating a Latin text. Nymph is a false friend because, of course, nymphed and nymphos, they don't actually mean nymph in a modern English sense. So I think there's a way that you can be misled, and then you can mislead your readers if you make the easy choice of this word looks similar, but it actually doesn't connote the same things. The question of who is me? And in a way, that's what the Odyssey is also about, right? Who is Odysseus? Is he the person who wants to spend 7 years with Calypso and has to be dragged away from being with Circe, or is he the person who's taking a nap while his men are eating the cattle?
And people are constantly asking him who he is too, right?
Who
What's
is
his
he?
name?
And he gives totally different answers depending who's asking, right? And I feel like I totally relate to that. It depends who's asking. How do I write? Who am I? It depends which text am I responding to? Who am I talking to? What situation am I in? I know who I am through seeing how I respond to other things in the world and also other things that I read. I think I discovered things about myself through having this very intense, close working relationship with the Odyssey over these past years. The question of, do I have a prior self? Do I have a prior agenda? I mean, of course I did on some level. Yes, of course there are things that are true in my daily life that have nothing to do with the Odyssey, or that I can, through some kind of stretch, make them have to do with the Odyssey, but they don't necessarily. But I don't know. I mean, maybe that sounds like an evasive answer, but maybe in a way that's also an Odyssean kind of thing, is to give an evasive
complicated
answer or give some kind of spin or some kind of fiction. I actually came from Crete. I didn't come from Britain at all.
I mean, it sounded to me like a perfectly lovely answer, but you're right that for some people that might come off as evasive. But again, as somebody who's also not nearly to the extent that you have, but who has dabbled a bit in working with other people's texts and so forth, what is lovely about that for me has always been that sense of both losing yourself and discovering new facets of yourself through that engagement with other people's writing.
And I certainly feel that. I feel that the process of just reading in general, of literary criticism as well as of translation, is partly about that, about the realizing that you can understand and you can feel for and be immersed in these totally different aspects of human experience, which might seem as if, of course, that should be worlds away from me, and of course it is worlds away from me, and yet I can be there on some level. I can be there, and even though the Odyssey is from thousands of years ago, and of course it's composed by people from a culture that's completely different from mine on some level, it can still feel completely close to me. I can still be somehow part of it.
Well, I'm afraid that's about all the time we have for today, unfortunately. Hopefully we'll have another excuse to talk with you, perhaps. I wanted to ask both of you about your work on the Norton Anthology and what it's like to anthologize, but we just got too excited about talking more about the Odyssey in translation. So, Emily, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much, Suzanne and Chris. It was great to talk to you.
So you can follow Emily on Twitter at EmilyRCWilson, and we'll put links in our show notes for her website and for more articles and interviews with her. You'll find those show notes at megaphonic.fm/spouter/15b. And you can find us on Twitter at The Spouter, and we would always love to hear from you. The Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts at Megaphonic FM. And so until next time.
Until next time, we'll see you again at The Spouter-Inn.